begin. Okay, I need to continue. Okay, thank you for joining this online event. Before we start, I'm going to share the screen with you for the to tell you some information for that we all have a nice and smooth online event. Okay. I need to become a host so that I can share the screen. However, I can start by thanking you for joining. We will be starting in just a minute. So you all know that you are muted. You can change your name and add your pronoun in the participants section below. You can also open the chat and see in the chat and say hello to the other participants and introduce yourself. Let me check if I can again now share my screen. Okay, I don't have this option for now. So I will.
Jasminka, sorry.
Okay.
I made you a co-host. You should be able to share the screen.
But it just says that only the host can share the screen. So.
It says that it gives you that message.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, just give me a minute.
Okay.
Please try again.
It says that these options are locked by the administrator, but I will say this without the slides. This online event is the accompanying event of the civil society reports the 10th year anniversary. You have the link to this report in the chat. And we are going to be talking about challenging exclusion and claiming rights to see the advancements in this year that have been made around the world. The topic of human rights, we have an all women panelists. It's going to be very interesting from all over the world. Our moderators today are Suhani Bushan, Diversity and Inclusion Coordinator at Civicus, and also she will be helped by Ines Pusadela, Senior Research Specialist at Civicus. To have the language that you would like to listen to, we are going to have an English and Spanish interpretation. You should click interpretation in the webinar controls and choose the language that you would like to listen to, English or Spanish. You have the microphone and video off. All the attendees will stay muted throughout the whole event, but we encourage you to interact with us through the question and answers box. You can ask questions and add comments in the chat box. Then we would have 2 Jamboards where you could also ask questions and add comments. And in the end, we also have one poll, short poll question. Please engage in commenting and asking, as I said, by using the Jamboard. Then you have also the question and answers box, and you have also the chat box. You could choose how you wish the speakers and other participants the speaker view section, if you want to see all of them or just the two of them on the screen. And how do you make the best out of this event? By listening actively, keep your video and microphone off, listen to the conversation, use the Zoom icons or chat box options to clap or support the things you have been shared and resonate with you. Engage by typing. If you feel like you have a comment or question to share, please do that in the chat section. And how do you still make the best of this event? Share your feedback in the end of the event. Check out the Civil Society Report 2020, which is available on the first link in the chat box. And of course, join the next event, which is going to be happening on the 17th of December. The time will be determined when, and on the topic of challenging systemic racism, Black Lives Matters in the USA and around the world. The event flow is that the first step for you is to listen to what experts have to say on the topic, then engage by commenting and asking questions and react to the expert responses with more questions or more questions in the chat box. So that's it. And now I will give the floor to Suhani.
Thank you so much, Jasminka. Hi, everyone. My name is Yuhani, as Jasminka said, and I am the Diversity and Inclusion Coordinator for Civicus. So we have a super exciting lineup for you today. Oops, sorry. There we go. So today, we've seen the focus of the webinar is challenging exclusion and claiming rights. 2020 has not been a great year for so many reasons, and especially with COVID, we've seen marginalized and excluded rights further oppressed, under attack, and had faced many of the worst impacts of COVID. However, this webinar is not really going to focus on that because we've had enough of, we've had enough to face these this year. But instead, we're going to focus more on the happiness and the great parts that happened in 2020 with excluded groups. So, for example, in Costa Rica, same-sex marriage became legal. In Chile, the ongoing constitutional progress included gender parity and representation quotas for Indigenous people. Other countries such as Sudan witnessed the abolition of rights that discriminated against women and abortion rights recognized in others, notably in New Zealand. So we have a great lineup, as Jasminka mentioned, a full women panelist panel today for you. And how it's going to go is we're going to invite each panelist to speak for about 5 minutes. After that, we will be asking some questions. So throughout people's speeches, please write your questions in the Q&A box or the chat box so then we can ask those questions for you. And I will, in order to get this started, I'm actually going to pass on to Ines, who's going to introduce our first panelist.
Thank you, Suhani. Hi, everybody. I will introduce our first panelist, and I will do so in Spanish. And I'm going to ask her some questions in Spanish, so get ready. Nuestra primera participante es Carolina Carrera, de Derechos Humanos y Justicia de Género. Carolina, es un gusto tenerte con nosotros. Chile va a tener una nueva constitución y que va a dar forma a esta nueva constitución será un 50% compuesto de mujeres. ¿Cómo se ha logrado la paridad de género? Y cómo bueno, ¿por qué es tan importante? ¿Cómo lo han conseguido? Y eso porque no se las dejara detrás, como ha sucedido tantas veces con tantas revoluciones a lo largo de la historia. ¿Y cómo piensas?
Hola, muchas gracias. Las quiero saludar a todas las panelistas y a quienes nos están escuchando. No sé si me escuchan bien. Bueno, lo primero es decir que para nosotras este es un hecho inédito no solo en Chile, sino que en el mundo, el poder contar, esta es la primera constitución que va a ser totalmente paritaria, y no estamos hablando de una paridad en candidaturas de las constituyentes, estamos hablando de paridad en los resultados finalmente de esta Asamblea Constitucional, ¿no? Esto se logra en realidad por el trabajo sostenido, sistemático del movimiento feminista en Chile y del movimiento de mujeres, que tiene un momento donde yo diría que es el más fuerte, el año 2018, donde en Chile está la llamada cuarta ola, ¿no?, del feminismo, donde las estudiantes secundarias y universitarias se toman los establecimientos y paran la educación durante varios meses por el tema de la violencia sexual, el acoso sexual, pero también por una educación no sexista y por un conjunto de demandas y por finalmente una igualdad sustantiva. Luego viene el 18 de octubre, ¿no es cierto?, donde la ciudadanía también se levanta y dice: no queremos más una constitución neoliberal que no otorga derechos ni garantías a las personas, y tenemos un 8 de marzo de este año donde marcharon solo en la región metropolitana más de 2 millones de mujeres. Entonces esto es el antesala para que cuando se canaliza todo esto a través del Congreso, ¿no es cierto?, que son quienes finalmente tienen que plantear esto de la nueva constitución, no era posible plantear una nueva constitución si no era paritaria, porque sabían que si lo hacían, la verdad es que iban a tener un estallido social nuevamente del movimiento mujer y feminista muy fuerte, y por tanto obligó a que fuera paritaria. Y nosotras tenemos muchas expectativas, ¿eh? Una cosa es que sea paritaria, dos, el trabajo que estamos haciendo para que las mujeres que salgan sean mujeres feministas, ojalá mayoritariamente, porque eso nos va a permitir avanzar. Y tres, aprender de lo que ha pasado también en otras constituciones de la región, pero también de otros países, Sudáfrica, hemos visto varias distintas, de cómo acompañar este proceso, estar alertas en este proceso durante, por ejemplo, ya estamos planteando, nos hemos organizado en Chile las mujeres, el movimiento feminista, en una gran asamblea, o los distintos feminismos, y estamos ya pensando cuáles van a ser las reglas del juego, que es lo primero que la Convención Constitucional tiene que establecer, ¿no? Si van a tener audiencias públicas, estamos pidiendo que sea descentralizada, es decir, que no solo sean en la capital, sino que en regiones se hagan audiencias, que sea abierta, que sea transparente, que se televise, o sea, que salga por la televisión, es decir, que nos dé la mayor garantía, que sea lo más participativa posible. Y por otro lado, estamos preparando equipos de compañeras que puedan acompañar a las constituyentes y estar entregando información, antecedentes. Una constituyente no tiene por qué saber de todo, y nosotras no queremos solamente centrarnos en los derechos humanos de las mujeres o en los principios que queremos, que por cierto, igualdad sustantiva, que por cierto, una vida libre de violencia, derechos sexuales y reproductivos, el tema de los cuidados. También queremos opinar sobre cómo queremos que sea el sistema político chileno. Si queremos un presidencialismo, un semipresidencialismo, si queremos un sistema parlamentario, si queremos un voto obligatorio o un voto voluntario, ¿no es cierto? Cómo queremos, si queremos un Estado plurinacional. Y ha sido bien interesante este proceso porque además lo hemos ido acompañando de encuestas. Acabamos de lanzar, por eso yo me voy a salir antes hoy día porque me están entrevistando las radios, una encuesta. Y una encuesta a mujeres. Solo mujeres, que la hicimos, donde lo que preguntábamos es, si iban a ir a votar, cómo participarían en las campañas de las mujeres. Entonces dicen, yo votaría mujer, llamaría a otras a votar mujer, participaría activamente. Más del 80% dice que con toda seguridad van a ir a votar. Le preguntamos también, esto que yo les comento, cuáles son los temas que les interesa que queden en la nueva constitución, y hablamos otra vez, vida libre de violencia, el tema de los cuidados, etc. Entonces, estamos armando también un clima que nos permita enfrentar esto, porque sabemos que no va a ser fácil. Conocemos las resistencias patriarcales y este es un país profundamente machista. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Carolina. Bueno, ya tenemos algunas preguntas para ti, pero antes quería enfatizar una cosa que acabas de decir que me parece muy importante, que es que bueno, no se trata solamente de hacer el proceso, ¿no? Que sea paritario y que sea abierto, equitativo, etcétera, sino que de obtener resultados, digamos, de políticas feministas y llevar temas a la agenda, ¿no? Y en relación con eso, bueno, un par de preguntas. Una tiene que ver con un poco con las protestas que mencionaste al principio de tu intervención. Hubo el año pasado una performance feminista que se hizo viral en todo el mundo, que fue repetida al hartazgo en todas las ciudades del mundo, y que era eso contra la violencia patriarcal, ¿no? Entonces la pregunta en ese sentido es, bueno, así como ahora están metiendo en la agenda de la constituyente, ¿no? De todos estos temas, ¿cómo hicieron para meter en la agenda de la protesta, que era enorme, variada, cómo lograron poner en primer plano la agenda feminista, ¿no? Eso por un lado. Y por otro lado, acá tenemos una pregunta en el chat donde preguntan cuán largo se prevé que sea este proceso, si tiene una línea de tiempo para el trabajo que van a hacer en la Constitución.
Perfecto. Respecto a lo primero, que es esta aparición de las tesis, ¿no? Que es un movimiento de la quinta región, que son feministas, y que esto nace a partir, ¿no es cierto?, de que en las protestas, en primera línea, lo que le llamaban la primera línea, habían también muchas mujeres. Y aquí hubieron dos fenómenos, ¿no? Ustedes saben que la violencia policial fue feroz, tuvimos una cantidad de lesionados y pérdida de visión tremendo, pero también hubo mucha denuncia de violencia sexual en las comisarías. Y esa violencia sexual que empieza a aparecer, que el Instituto Nacional de Derechos Humanos empieza a dar cuenta, hace, entre otras cosas, es un detonante para que las tesis saquen esto que se repite, ¿no es cierto?, en todos los países, que es la violencia patriarcal, ¿no es cierto?, y contra también la violencia policial. Yo creo que esos son de los fenómenos que es como el ni una menos cuando nace en Argentina y se replica en el resto de los países. Aquí yo diría que fue un poco más grande porque en todos los países del mundo casi vimos que se replicó constantemente. Entonces creo que tiene que ver con que hay en Chile una violencia hacia las mujeres muy fuerte, que estaba muy naturalizada, que en dictadura, nosotros tuvimos una larga dictadura, la violencia sexual fue un método sistemático permanente de tortura, y cuando hay impunidad, cuando no hay castigo y sanción, en tiempos de paz se repite en situaciones como esta. Entonces volvemos a ver, ¿no es cierto?, que la violencia sexual en las detenciones vuelve a aparecer no ahora, sino que venía apareciendo ya hace largos años con las estudiantes, pero muy fuertemente en estas últimas protestas. Eso es lo uno. ¿Cuál largo el proceso? El proceso tiene fecha. Las elecciones van a ser el 11 de abril, no sé, perdón, es un año. Es un año que tiene la constituyente para debatir y lograr, pero tiene un periodo de, no me recuerdo si son 3 o 6 meses más que puede participar. El 11 de enero se inscriben las candidaturas y en abril se vota.
Muy bien, muchas gracias. Laura te había hecho esta pregunta, no sé si Laura quiere repreguntar algo antes de que pasemos a la siguiente.
No, súper, me contesta muy claro, nada más, mucha suerte, es muy poco tiempo para lograr una tarea tan grande.
Laura, perdón.
No. No estoy en mute, ¿me oís ahí?
Sí,
No.
la escucho. Yo la veo.
Okay.
¿Me oís? Ok. Lo que decía era que es una tarea gigante para tan poco tiempo, pero que me queda bastante claro. Mucha suerte.
Muchas gracias, Laura.
Bueno, entonces, Carolina, pasamos a nuestra segunda intervención. Suhani, you can go ahead.
So, and thank you so much for that, Carolina. That was amazing to see the work that you've been doing. Our next speaker is Fahima Hashim, the former director of Salma Women's Resource Center in Sudan. So Fahima, welcome. I have a few questions for you. So my questions are, how are recent advances in women's rights, such as the criminalization of female genital mutilation and the abolition of discriminatory laws, achieved? Is there a connection between the roles women played in the revolution and the subsequent rollback of conservative laws imposed by the deposed regime? What challenges remain? What needs to change next? And what are women doing to achieve this change? So a lot of questions for you, Fahima. Oh, sorry, Fahima, you're just...
Oh, I need to unmute. Okay.
I can hear you perfectly now.
Thank you very much for this invitation. And I really wanted to be more prepared. But anyway, I think the issues are all intact, and I have enthusiastic to come into a webinar that talks about success stories in this 2020 year, which is really terrible to everybody. But I'm glad to contribute and say the abolition of FGM, or female genital mutilation in Sudan, which took place with this government in April, May this year. It's not the first time, by the way. This law has been worked out by the women organization in the last more than 40 years ago to abolish FGM, because FGM was used as a tradition, as part of the culture. So cultural issues usually take longer than we could plan and advocate to end and abolish. So then the last 30 years with the fundamentalist Muslim government, they gave it a kind of a crown it with a religion element. So culture and religion in a context of a conservative society, it made FGM even much more harder for women to advocate against. So despite this, all the work that has been done throughout, as I said, over 40 years, women have been fighting to abolish FGM. But then in 2013, in 2010, there was a new law coming up, the child law, where Sudan has signed already by then the Rights of the Child Convention, and they wanted to do that as no reservation taken. So a law, Article 13 of that law, came as abolishing FGM. But then, unfortunately, it was that law, that article was removed before the final reading of the law, because the pressure from the fundamentalists and the Salafi groups did not allow the government to pursue that. So then the article was pulled back, and then people again started from scratch to advocate to abolish FGM. And thank God for this revolution that made that happen. And it was one of the first steps that was taken to abolish FGM. But it's a long story. It's still among 10 in every 10 girls, one is being mutilated. So you can imagine how long that will take. And I think for your question about, I always see laws are important, but laws are not enough. We need to do a lot to make those laws really in place, because 3 years of punishment or imprisonment for a person who practiced this, are we criminalizing parents? Are we criminalizing the practitioners? How are we looking at it? I think it takes a long range of awareness raising in the society, using all media possible tools, using schools and school curricula. It has to become embedded inside the social, you know, the thinking and the the sorry, and the people has to take that as a serious issue. So it has to really, it takes longer than we could imagine, but I think it's the first step. Having that law in place in itself, it's a big success. Another success that I want to mention that you didn't ask about, which was the most harder law that affected women's life on the last 30 years, is the public order law, where women are not allowed to mingle in public spaces wearing anything that is not quote unquote called Sharia dress. So women are restricted in their mobility, restricted in their dress, restricted in coming, being in place where young boys or men are in the place. So it's a lot. So this has been taken over. This has been abolished now with this government after the revolution, and I think it's a very big success story. These two laws has been really fought for the last. I can imagine that the last 30 years, never the women's movement never kept quiet not to advocate against it. There's marches. There are women who went to court who were lashed. They never stopped fighting to end these laws. Yet, despite all this, we have been always challenged by the Sharia laws that was in place since 1991. We have still to deal with personal law, which is still a very hard one. Still, guardianship is there for men. Like one, and then women in working on these personal laws have always been hindered by any advocacy program they do by the government, saying personal laws are Sharia, so no one is allowed to talk about it. So we always go from one argument to another. And now, after the revolution, a month ago, a new committee was formed representing almost around 11 women and three lawyers to sit down and make a new law for the family law in Sudan, trying to dismiss the 1991 family law that has really been hindered and made the life difficult for women to get divorced, to get custody for children, to get uh, even their mobility, because one of the articles says uh, even if you are a working woman, women in Sudan has gotten their right to work since the 1950s or early 60s. But there is a guardian law that you cannot even go out to work if your husband is not permitting you. So this article has really made life difficult for a lot of women.
Mhm.
And thank God now women are sitting to revise these laws.
Thank you
And
so much.
there's many other laws, but I think, as I said, this movement never stopped. I just want to finalize my talk with the last success story. Also, in 2008, there was a campaign took place to end, because rape is defined as adultery. Okay, so rape in our law is defined as adultery. If I go to court and I'm raped, if say I have been raped, that means I have a proof that I'm committing adultery. So that made life difficult for women who get raped, and women, especially after the conflict in several places in Sudan, that really rape was used as a tool. So women were not getting just into that. So there's a huge campaign built by alliances of groups. 11 organizations came together, and we took that like around. I was part of this story, so we took that for 8 years, and after 8 years, we were able to change and at least have rape defined in the law different than adultery. So there are many efforts and many good stories. Despite the difficulties, women never stop fighting for rights. And I think still as we're talking about all these success stories, today in this webinar, I see that, for example, sex work is still in my country is criminalized. Homosexuality and same-sex relations is still criminalized, and I think still a long way to go. But I see now some lights coming up, people who are advocating for these issues. And yeah, I think the women's movement is born always I think the fighting back and forth to make women's rights and make them in place and make them happen, and that resistance never stopped, and that resilience as well never stopped. So yeah, I think it's what I say that the younger generation now, who have been representing more than 60% of the revolution, demonstrators today, have been now creating a different voice. And I wish that these new voices are giving a chance to really, navigate new spaces, navigate new rights, and navigate issues of safe abortion, navigate issues of gay rights, navigate issues that concerns them and concerns the younger generation in different parts of Sudan. And so I hope things will go as it's going on now, but still restrictions are there.
Thank you so much for that, Fahima. That was amazing to see all of those success stories. And you actually already answered my follow-up question. So perhaps maybe we can, if anyone has any other questions, to put them in the chat and we can get to them at the last section, because at the end of this, we do have another 20 minutes for other Q&A questions. So please do add any questions you get in the chat and we can get to those in the last segment. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Great. Now let's move on to our third panelist for today, Terry Bellamack, who's from the Abortion Law Reform Association of New Zealand. So welcome, Terry. And Terry, my questions, I'll say questions, plural, for you are, so back in March, when we heard about the legislation of abortion in New Zealand, our first question was, what? Wasn't it already legal? And it came as further surprise to learn that this has been a decades-long process. So would you tell us about the different tactics used by the women's rights movement to shift public opinion and change policy? And what kind of opposition did you face? And what do you think was the key to success?
Great. Tēnā koutou katoa. Really happy to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. This has already been so cool. The last speaker, I was really enjoying that. They've made so much progress. It's wonderful. So to get back to your questions, yeah, a lot of New Zealanders were actually surprised too that we didn't have abortion on demand, because in a weird sort of way, we had kind of a weird hybrid system where abortion was illegal, but you could get one if you were willing to lie about your mental health. The law was created back in 1977, and even at that time, it was quite retrograde for the time that it was made. So yeah, this is probably the reason also that the law lasted so long, because practice shifted away from the letter of the law very early. So 98% of abortions in New Zealand for 40 years were granted on the mental health ground. So if you were willing to lie about your mental health, you could get an abortion. And that's an easy one. People have died for reproductive rights. People have died in order to get abortions. Lying about your mental health, lots of people were willing to do that. Having that sort of release valve let pressure off the system. So people were able to ignore it for a really long time. People who, the people who were getting abortions didn't really want to talk about it because they just wanted it done. They just wanted it over. And abortion stigma, of course, which was, extremely prevalent everywhere and probably still is, stop people talking about it. So that's why one of the reasons that the system lasted so long. Unfortunately, the system as it was also left a lot of people out of it. I'm talking specifically about people in rural communities who tend to be, more economically disadvantaged. So the system, in addition to being demeaning, requiring you to lie to your doctors, it also, it was unequitable. It left people out, and that was another huge problem. So I think one of the reasons that it lasted so long, as again, the fact that there was that release valve, but it's Parliament at the time in 1977 was not particularly representative. There have been, studies in terms of, how shortly afterwards, New Zealand started to study how to make Parliament more representative. So we changed the voting system in 1993. And since then, parliaments have been more representative of the people who actually live in the country and feel things about politics. Now, in terms of tactics, we suspected that public opinion wasn't the thing that needed shifting. And poll results confirmed that. Early in the piece, we conducted our own poll, for the first time in a very long time. And we discovered that, yeah, actually a majority of New Zealanders supported abortion on demand. And this was not a huge surprise. It's been a long time in this country and probably in many other countries as well, that the population is much less conservative than the elite, than the parliament, than the people who are, governing the country. So we began calling out the perversity of a system that requires you to lie about your mental health in order to get health care. I mean, it's an embarrassment, especially for a country like New Zealand that prides itself on, its feminist credentials. New Zealand likes to think of themselves as one of the earliest adopters of recognizing women's right to vote. So it was calling out that as an embarrassment was also an important tactic for us. Anyway, our message about that, that disconnect really resonated. And during the next election cycle, which was coming up very fast, we have our election cycles come up every 3 years here. The Labour Party came out in favor of reform. And when Labour got in, they actually put some political capital behind the fight, which changed everything pretty much. So as a result, because the government was actually putting this forward as a government bill, we followed the experience of the Irish referendum and stuck with a simple, positive message that people should decide for themselves whether and when to become parents. And we just hammered that home. And that was a message that really resonated because New Zealanders, we don't like to be told what to do. And we like things that are simple and make sense. So that, again, that was kind of a good angle to take, and we just kept hammering it home. In terms of the opposition that we faced, it was mostly from your fringe religious extremists under the traditional family banner. In our favor was the fact that their reputation was really tainted historically by positions they had taken on other issues, like supporting parents hitting their children or opposing contraception. So I think many of the arguments they made didn't really resonate quite as much because they sounded disingenuous, because in many cases they were. Also, New Zealand is a very secular country. Half the population affiliates with absolutely no religion at all. And the next highest is like Anglican, and that's less than 8%. So religious positions are kind of a hard sell. And that's kind of that this also, was militating in our favor. Most New Zealanders also are not in traditional families. So, the traditional family arguments weren't really resonating there either. Most New Zealanders have blended families, and marriage has been declining because civil unions offer pretty much, the same legal protections. Yeah, we actually experienced, the changes that we were arguing for it was actually more of a threat that the Labour government's coalition partner, which was much more conservative than them, they were much more instrumental in holding things back, trying to make things go slower, trying to water down the legislation that we were talking about. So now we have a new law, and the new law is a lot better. We have abortion on demand, basically, until up to 20 weeks gestation. And that 20 weeks, it doesn't really mean very much. It's kind of it's a ridiculous cutoff point, but it came from the old law. After 20 weeks, you can get an abortion if a doctor approves, and they can approve on grounds mainly to do with if they're satisfied that the person's physical health, mental health, and general well-being would be enhanced by having an abortion. Now you can, abortion was provided by the health system before, and it still is. So there's no question of, citizens and permanent residents, it's available for free, and which is a really good thing. The law was passed as, just to continue the litany of how much better it's, okay. Anyway, that's the short story. So thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Terry. And actually, Laura has a great comment. Costa Rica had a similar situation where the practice and law disconnected, but in the opposite direction. We had a law in place since the 70s as well that allowed therapeutical abortions when the woman's life or health were at risk, but the practice has become restrictive, leaving health out of the factors to consider in order to obtain an abortion. She's saying that hearing you speak, Terry, is almost if two countries were in the exact same legal condition, but reacted in polar opposite directions. Do you have any advice or reactions for Costa Rica and Laura?
Yeah, that's a tough one. And I think there's a lot of countries that are kind of in that situation, like Italy. They started out with a really liberal law, but it was conscientious obstruction that has changed things in Italy. And it's difficult to give advice on that without understanding the drivers of what caused that shift in Costa Rica. If it was conscientious obstruction, then again, it's very much a cultural issue, and that's a tough one. That's a really tough one, because on one hand, you don't want people providing abortions that don't want to, because obviously that could be really unpleasant. So yeah, it requires a change in the culture itself that is, again, it's hard and it's long term.
Thank you so much, Terry. I think that's super helpful to a lot of people in this fight right now. So that's great. Before we move on to our next panelist, we actually are going to do a Jamboard. We've heard, especially from Terry, some of the tactics being used, and from Fahima, the successes, and from Carolina, all the different modes and approaches that we're using. So what we're trying to do with this Jamboard, so Jasmine, if you can actually put it in the chat. Oh, you already have, thank you. We want to know about what challenges you have faced with challenging exclusion and claiming rights, and also what tactics you've used. So if you want on this Jamboard, you can click on the pink post-it and type in some of the challenges, or click on the blue post-it and type in some of the responses or tactics. You can also use some of the green post-its to type in any questions you have from anything that's been said so far. And we're just gonna mute for 5 minutes while you do this. So we'll start again chatting in 5 minutes. Please start to fill in the Jamboard. Anything else you wanted to add, Ines?
No, I'm good. I mean, if we do this in less than 5 minutes, then we can start chatting. But let's see. Let's see how fast we do.
Great.
Just in case anybody's having trouble, you just need to double click on the sticky notes, and then you can edit and write on it.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Salim, are you ready and back? Can we hear Salim on the Spanish channel? Yeah, okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, thanks everyone for that. There's been some interesting questions we received and a lot of comments and tactics about the cultural aspect of things, the culture versus conservative beliefs, or just looking at social responses, detaching from the law and the cultural shift, having reforms that people can easily understand. So really interesting on kind of trying to find that balance between legal reform and the overall culture, and seeing if sometimes it's not able to be balanced, or if so, how do we kind of get around that? So I think some of these would be really easy, and it would be great for us to maybe explore a bit further in the larger Q&A. So to our panelists, maybe perhaps start thinking about that, how you like to answer some of this, and we can kind of come back to that. But I'm going to actually pass on to Ines for our next panelist, and then perhaps we can answer some of the Jamboard questions in the final Q&A.
Thank you, Suhani. Yes, some of the questions are directed to some of the speakers in particular. There's a question for Fahima, and there's also some other questions that were not written on the Jamboard, but on the chat box. But we're going to go back to all of these questions at the end, when we discuss this at the end. So, okay, so we're going to welcome our next speaker, Laura Valenciano. I'm going to speak in Spanish now. Bienvenida, Laura, de Asociación Ciudadana Acceder. Okay. Sorry, I had to mute my audio, otherwise I keep listening. Entonces, Laura, la novedad en Costa Rica es que en el mes de marzo, un fallo de la Corte Suprema Centroamérica, o sea, lo que nosotros llamamos el matrimonio igualitario. Y me imagino que no fue tan fácil como ir a los tribunales y exigirles que hicieran su trabajo. Debe haber llevado muchísimo más trabajo. ¿Cuánto tiempo llevó este proceso y qué tácticas tuvieron que utilizar para que este derecho fuera reconocido?
Okay. Gracias por invitarme. Estoy súper contenta de estar acá. En realidad, cuando mencionamos este año, digamos, habría que echarse todavía o hacerse para atrás un año completo para el fallo de la Sala Constitucional. Entonces, para poder contextualizarlo, tal vez en 5 minutos, voy a hacerme para atrás una década. Porque si bien el logro de matrimonio igualitario es producto de trabajo de muchísimo tiempo, de personas que vienen trabajando el tema de los derechos de las personas LGBTIQ+, desde hacía muchísimo más, esta década última ha sido crucial. Entonces, en el 2010 se da en Costa Rica un intento por grupos conservadores de plantear lo que se conocía como el referéndum del miedo, que fue técnicamente el nombre muy exitoso que le da a la sociedad civil en su momento, la oposición, ¿verdad?, a este planteamiento de poner los derechos de una minoría a la voluntad y voto de la mayoría y del voto popular. Ahí finalmente se logra enterrar esa iniciativa con la idea principal de que los derechos humanos no tienen por qué ni siquiera ponerse a debatir, ¿verdad?, y que no debía votarse. Y eso tal vez nos va dando un poco la contextualización en la que nos encontrábamos. 2 años después, en esa misma Asamblea Legislativa, se nombra como presidente de la Comisión de Derechos Humanos a un antiderechos, súper reconocido, y se da por medio de una negociación del partido mayoritario en aquel entonces y este partido evangélico y cristiano que existía, que tenía un asiento, y se lo dan a él el puesto de presidencia en la Comisión de Derechos Humanos, que fue creo yo, crucial también para crear una reacción en sociedad civil, ¿verdad? Que lograra una articulación que se gestó, digamos, algo que se conoció como el movimiento de los invisibles, movimiento invisibles, que generó lo que yo creería, por lo menos en mi tiempo de vida, la mayor marcha como politizada por los derechos de la población LGBTIQ, que fue una marcha gigante que abarcó como esta avenida principal, y que definitivamente sentó un precedente para cómo iban a ser las manifestaciones sociales en términos de derechos de la población LGBTIQ en Costa Rica. Eso fue 2012. Y es justamente como una acción-reacción que se genera un espacio de coordinación de sociedad civil que empieza como a agrupar a las diferentes organizaciones que venían trabajando por los derechos humanos de las personas LGBTIQ en Costa Rica, que tal vez estaban trabajando pero de manera desarticulada, y se empiezan a colaborar en lo que se viene a conocer como el Frente por los Derechos Igualitarios. El Frente de Derechos Igualitarios, el FDI, que es como se le conoce acá, empieza a trabajar en el 2013 y empieza a trabajar como con un norte súper claro de matrimonio igualitario. Hasta entonces, todos los temas que se habían trabajado, todos los temas que se habían trabajado eran por uniones de hecho o sociedades de convivencia o cosas por el estilo. Y voy a tener que hacer un súper brinco, pero entonces es la primera vez que se posiciona matrimonio igualitario como figura específica, ¿verdad? Y después en el 2016 tenemos un gobierno en el cual se hace una opinión consultiva a la Corte Interamericana de Derechos Humanos, en la cual se plantea justamente una aclaración. La Costa Rica le pide a la Corte que aclare cómo tiene que aplicar de manera muy inteligente, porque este es un gobierno distinto que tenía digamos, ese colmillo jurídico para poder hacer esta jugada, y le plantea esta pregunta a la Corte que hablaba de dos temas: derechos de reconocimiento del nombre de las personas trans y matrimonio igualitario, pero en términos solamente de derechos patrimoniales de parejas del mismo sexo. Y la Corte Interamericana tarda su rato, y en el 2018 saca su respuesta y dice, se menciona, digamos, de los dos temas, pero en cuanto a los derechos patrimoniales va un poco más allá y dice que no podemos estar inventando figuras adicionales diferentes o lo que sea, que eso ya en sí es discriminatorio y que tenemos que aplicar la ley como corresponde, y que los derechos humanos, para no discriminar, corresponderían entonces a la figura de matrimonio igualitario. Entonces, la aplicación de esto, que sí se pasa a la sala constitucional, y la sala constitucional patea la bola, se lo da a la Asamblea Legislativa y le da como un año de plazo para que legisle, y al no legislar en ese año, entonces entraría a regir, digamos, sin ninguna discriminación, que fue lo que pasó. Entonces técnicamente este año lo logramos, pero fue por esa patada de un año de la Asamblea Legislativa, de la Sala Constitucional.
Muy bien, perfecto. Muchas gracias. Excelente. La verdad que se ve muy claramente cómo se combinaron las diferentes tácticas y se reforzaron unas a otras, ¿no? Y también para resaltar, ¿no?, el hecho de que con la consulta, esa consulta jurídica, en realidad fue una jugada política de primer orden, ¿no es cierto? No, de jurídico no tenía demasiado, o sea, realmente fue una jugada política para conseguir este resultado. Bueno, te hago una sola pregunta que apareció por el chat y que tiene que ver con también lo que se estuvo discutiendo por lo menos escribiendo en el Jamboard, que tiene que ver con, bueno, con algo que mencionabas al principio, ¿no?, de que todo esto empezó con una jugada enorme de los antiderechos, ¿no?, y que estaban muy movilizados y muy organizados en Costa Rica. Entonces la pregunta tiene que ver con el cambio cultural, ¿no?, y que en qué medida este cambio, que finalmente se dio, ni siquiera fueron los representantes del pueblo en la asamblea, fue la corte, ¿no? Este cambio, en qué medida ha sido aceptado, o de que si se espera o no una reacción conservadora, qué trabajo hay que hacer ahora para que estos derechos se concreten.
Ok, hay definitivamente una polarización muy, muy fuerte social en este momento, que claramente tiene un componente religioso. Costa Rica es un ejemplo más de esta avanzada fundamentalista en la región, como la hemos visto, por ejemplo, en Colombia, en Perú, en Brasil, y por supuesto que en Estados Unidos. Pero la elección del 2018, que es justamente después, o durante, más bien, cuando sale la OC 24, que se refiere a los derechos de las personas, hace que crezca todavía más, se crea como esta brecha gigante en la población en torno a los derechos de la población LGBTIQ. Y finalmente logramos volcar, digamos, las elecciones, nos salvamos de un gobierno fundamentalista evangélico, de un pastor que era el candidato presidencial, pero logran la mayor cantidad de escaños en la Asamblea Legislativa que se han logrado hasta ahora. Entonces, desde entonces no han parado de presionar, de atacar derechos humanos, no solamente de la población LGBTIQ, sino también de derechos reproductivos y sexuales de las mujeres, muy, muy claramente. Entonces el trabajo de sociedad civil va un poco por ahí. En términos de matrimonio igualitario, se manejó una campaña en la cual estuvo involucrada el FDI también, del cual Acceder forma parte, pero se manejó con asistencia, por ejemplo, de diplomática de las embajadas y cosas por el estilo, para trabajar un poco esa percepción social y el recibimiento, digamos, de la población de la figura de matrimonio igualitario que iba a entrar a regir. Y se creó una campaña que se llama Sí Acepto, y salían como familiares de las personas LGBTIQ un poco diciendo como yo amo a mi familiar, bla, 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 ¿verdad? Y como pensado desde el lado positivo, que yo creo que le preparó un poco la cancha para que entrara en vigencia, digamos, ya la figura de matrimonio igualitario con menor oposición, planteada desde el amor, desde ¿verdad? Como desde ese lado y no desde todos los otros derechos. Tenemos hasta ahora 450 parejas que ya han inscrito su matrimonio en los últimos 6 meses. Entonces, es impresionante.
Thank you so much, Laura. I think that's a great message to also end that with. There's been so much, closing space for LGBTQI communities around the world and focusing on the love and the happiness, and it's such a great way to kind of end the year with that kind of great successful story. So thank you so much for that. That was a wonderful example. We're now going to move to our next speaker, which is Yasmin Ullah, who's the former president of the Rohingya Human Rights Network in Canada and is originally from Myanmar. So Yasmin, hello and welcome. I have some questions for you. In early 2020, the International Court of Justice ruled against Myanmar, ordering the state to take all measures within its power to protect Rohingya Muslims from genocide and report regularly about its progress. Would you tell us a bit about your work and that of other Rohingya advocates to raise international awareness and seek redress? How important is this ruling and what needs to be done so it has actual impact on the ground?
Thank you very much for Civicus for actually inviting me to be part of this really, really important conversation. I've learned a lot for the past, matter of hour, and really, really inspiring to hear from so many prominent activists and people who've been actively working on the causes that needs attention. The issue of the Rohingya have been prevalent and really on the back burner for quite some time in terms of the international attention. I could actually make this even more personal because I actually am a daughter of someone who was fighting for the rights of Rohingya for the past few decades. And during his time working for the Rohingya cause, he was not actually recognized. It was really, really difficult to actually engage with policymakers, especially from the international realm. At the beginning of my work, even though I have a little bit of background in that, I didn't really know how to do anything or where to start. It was more of a role that I decided I want to jump into, and it was a learning process. But I had this burning feeling that I needed to do something or else my family and my people would be in jeopardy, and that our history would be erased altogether. So I started organizing locally, organizing protests and events to educate people about who Rohingya are, first and foremost, because in Canada, there have been very minimal coverage and little to no attention when it comes to, when I say I'm a Rohingya, people are like, where is it? Who are you? Where are you from? And so that rudimentary level of knowledge has not been widespread. So we had to address that. really fast, because we needed to, bring people from a 0 to 100 really quickly in order for them to actually support us in reaching out to policymakers and whatnot. So slowly I started to connect with other people, and a lot of these people are not Rohingyas directly, but there's a little bit of a small community here that we worked with. And so we traveled to meet members of parliament together in Ottawa at the capital of our country, and we connect with even more people, and then we started to brainstorm, come up with strategy to engage policymakers in Canada and the general public. And slowly we moved and branched out to museums, because there are a couple of museums that are directly and indirectly working on the issues of mass atrocity, like the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, which is a nationally federally funded entity. And so there is a lot more rules and regulations, so we can sort of pull in order for them to actually pay attention to these sort of mass atrocities that are happening, especially to what happened to the Rohingya people that actually led to 740,000 people leaving Myanmar, leaving Rakhine State, my hometown, to Bangladesh to seek refuge there. So there was a little bit of media attention around that. So we used that to leverage the idea of the urgency. And so slowly we started to call on them to engage with us, and eventually we were able to push for an exhibition to be curated. And not only that, we actually were able to bring together a pool of people who are refugees, who were settled as a refugee in Canada, to share their own stories, and turned that into an oral history project, which changed into something that was collected as a national archive, which is a really huge step, because it means that Rohingya are now being recognized as a fabric of the Canadian society, which is not something we were recognized for in Myanmar, our own homeland. It's a very, very ironic situation there. Now, a lot of other things also, started to happen. We were able to help pick some of the photos that were captured by a Canadian photographer, Kevin Freyer, who actually went to take photos of the exodus as it was coming in, as the lines and lines of people were crossing the border into Bangladesh. And so there were some other artifacts, like ID cards that were used as a process of othering during from 1942 onward. And then we also have some cultural artifacts to showcase the idea of who Rohingya are as an identity. And so the Time to Act Rohingya Voices exhibition has now been launched since 2019 and is going to still be there until early next year. And we also worked on the project called Genocide Learning Tool, and that is a learning tool for high school students to be able to learn about the Holocaust in comparison to the othering process that happened to the Rohingya. And this was a huge puzzle pieces that came together, because we needed to have children learning about the Holocaust, but also, with the same token, we needed to draw on the examples of that in order for us not to repeat the same mistakes that we have made. And so we work on this public awareness, and we pushed on a lot more things with the government, constantly calling our members of parliament and making sure that they're hearing about the most recent updates. And further in 2018, the parliament actually passed a motion unanimously, both the Senate and the House of Commons, to actually call and define what happened to Rohingya as genocide, which was a huge success, not just for us Rohingya Canadian here, but also throughout the civil society groups that are working on this issue as well. And the Canadian government then pledged $300 million to help better the situation of the Rohingya in Bangladesh and elsewhere. And we also asked for the Canadian government to actually initiate the process at the International Court of Justice, but they didn't. The good thing is they've actually committed to intervene in the case that the Gambia had brought, fortunately. So earlier this year, they've committed to do that with the Netherlands, which is our allies. And so things are moving, but it's not moving at the pace that we might want. And so I'm going to end here that it's quite significant that there is it speaks to the nature of the concerns that and the condemnation that nation states actually are starting to gain and started to garner. And it is the rebuking, direct rebuking of the faulty judiciary system that is written with the military personnels and powers in Myanmar, because it has not been able to actually, prosecute people who are involved in actually persecuting people, minorities or not, having the status or not. And so even though currently the case at the International Court of Justice, as well as the International Criminal Court, and many other mechanisms that are moving right now, is not going to directly affect people on the ground inside Myanmar and in Bangladesh, it still will help reduce some of the frustration and anxiety that is experienced by the people through their displacement and the destitute situations in the camps. And it will also provide as a watchful and magnifying glass on the Myanmar's action in moving forward in any persecution that will take place inside Myanmar, regardless of whether or not that will happen to the Rohingya. And so at the end, it will be really, really important that the court's the court's order, because the ruling will happen in the next few years, whether or not that happens in our favor, at least it humanizes Rohingya, because that has been the process, that has been the intent from the get-go, that the Myanmar authorities will dehumanize us so much that the value that we hold within us is not enough for the world to even bat an eye when something happens to us. So it's the word protected group that is really, really important and is a turning point. And I think that we will see that more and more in the making. This is a history in the making. And so I'm really, really hopeful, but also I'm realistic about the circumstances at the same time. It'll be up to us, actually, the Rohingya, to actually secure our future. But we're going to have to use the international community to be the machinery for us to actually move forward and rebuilding our own community and building the allyship and understanding within the ethnic communities across Myanmar, for us to be able to go back and rebuild and live in peace as we deserve.
Thank you so much for that, Yasmin. That was very inspirational and wonderful. So thank you for sharing that so much. That's been a great success, especially in getting the 300 million. That's a lot. So I wanted to ask, as a follow-up, what was kind of, I think, the tipping point that you found that the Canadian government, to get the Canadian government to actually act? You have a bunch of tactics that you mentioned. What was kind of, do you think, was kind of the major influence? And how do you think that also worked with the international influence as well, with different national governments and civil society organizations?
I think that it was a collective work, not just from within Canada by the Rohingya Canadian communities or the civil society groups that are supporting us, but also the noises that are being made around the world in the media coverage of the plight in the Rohingya refugees in the camps, actually voicing their own concerns, which is a really huge part, is the autonomy that the refugees have in order to tell their own stories. And a lot of politicians, a lot of Canadian policymakers have actually seen with their own eyes what happened on the ground in the refugee camps. And so they were part of the mission to go and investigate, to go and actually interview people. And there was a creation of the special envoy, who is the Honorable Bob Ray, who had done his, had complete his mandate, and now he's the U.S. ambassador. The ambassador to the US from Canada. And so there were a lot of different parts of this that have actually moved things and really pushed forward for the right kind of actions to be taken. But one of the things that I find really, really helpful was that from my very first visit to the parliament, we have used the term genocide. We've not backed down when people said ethnic cleansing. We've not backed down when people said ethnic violence. We've never said it in any other way. And we use the right terminology because we knew that eventually the term genocide is a very legal term. In order for us to push this further into the international justice mechanism, we have to use the right term. And it is what it is. It actually has been, called genocide by many, many legal experts, many historical experts who have seen and witnessed some of those things happen in the past. And so this was, I think, I don't know if it's a turning point, but it was the consistency that we have. And actually, this was the same word that we have been using in terms of the activist within our community. So we repeated the same sort of legal term enough times that people are like, okay, why is this so important to you? Until that the Gambia had picked up the case and sort of compared and draw on the examples of the previous genocides that we've had.
Thank you so much. And this is a great way to finish, because actually I think it's a common denominator to many of the struggles that we've been listening about today. All right, because I mean, calling things by their name and framing a situation as genocide. I mean, it's exactly the same as with women's rights movement framing, women's rights as human rights, or LGBTQI rights as human rights, or just refusing to speak about civil unions and pushing for equal marriage. And so it's I think it's a great tactic, really, to stick to a certain framing and just call things by their name. Thank you so much, Yasmin. We are going to move on to our last speaker. And I warned you that this second section is very heterogeneous. We're going to hear now about a different set of rights that were pushed and achieved in 2020. I'm going to speak in Spanish now. Le voy a dar la bienvenida a Olimpia Castillo, de la Asociación Civil y Educación Ambiental de México. Y la razón por la cual vamos a hablar de México ahora es que hace no mucho, a principios de noviembre, México ratificó el acuerdo de Escazú. Fue el país número 11 en ratificar este acuerdo, y al hacerlo hizo que el acuerdo entrara en vigor. Le vamos a preguntar entonces a Olimpia por qué este es un tratado clave, fundamental, de derechos humanos. De modo que, de qué modo están conectados las cuestiones ambientales y los derechos humanos. Y bueno, de paso vamos a hacer algunas preguntitas extra. Por ejemplo, el rol de la sociedad civil en este proceso, ya que se trata de, del Estado de México que ratificó el acuerdo. ¿Qué rol tuvo la sociedad civil para que esto ocurriera? ¿Y qué rol tendrá la sociedad civil en lo sucesivo?
Ok, muchas gracias. Aquí tengo medio complicada esta tarde la comunicación porque me es más fácil ver el chat y todo lo demás en mi laptop, pero el audio no quiere funcionar, entonces estoy conectada en el celular para hablar con ustedes y en la laptop para poder seguir la conversación. Pero bueno, ya saben que la tecnología siempre nos falla cuando más la necesitamos. Bien, esta mañana agradezco mucho la invitación de poder estar compartiendo con tantas mujeres estos trabajos tan interesantes que se han venido realizando. Y yo les quiero compartir, sí, lo que está sucediendo en México, pero no solo en mi país, sino que es un proceso regional que estamos llevando de manera conjunta en América Latina y el Caribe. Es un proceso en el que ya llevamos varios años y muchas organizaciones involucradas sobre el acuerdo regional sobre el acceso a la información, la participación pública y el acceso a la justicia en asuntos ambientales en América Latina y el Caribe. Este acuerdo fue adoptado en marzo de 2018 en la municipalidad de Escazú, en Costa Rica. Por eso, de manera sintética, se le conoce como Acuerdo de Escazú. El proceso inició, bueno, desde 2012, cuando en la cumbre de Río +20, 10 países firmaron la declaración para dar inicio a un proceso que diera cumplimiento al principio 10 de la Declaración de Río, que refiere que para poder atender los asuntos ambientales, pues se necesita la participación de toda la sociedad en el nivel que le corresponde. Pero para poder participar, pues la gente necesita contar con acceso a la información y además con mecanismos de justicia que le permitan pues reclamar desde la negación de los derechos de acceso o incluso la restitución de los daños. Este principio 10, bueno, de hecho, la Declaración de Río no es vinculante, así que se necesitaba un instrumento que pudiera darle cumplimiento a este principio, y de ahí se deriva este proceso para tener en la región un instrumento regional que nos garantizara los derechos de acceso. Hubo 2 años de preparación y luego se vinieron los años de negociación. Fueron 9 reuniones de negociación, la última en Costa Rica, pero aquí un detalle muy importante fue que en todo el proceso de negociación, las organizaciones de la sociedad civil tuvimos voto en las reuniones, perdón, tuvimos voz, no voto, en las reuniones. Es decir, podíamos levantar la mano para hacer intervenciones y propuestas al documento, algunos avances importantes como lo fue la inclusión del artículo 9, del cual comentaré un poquitín más adelante, fueron aportaciones de las organizaciones de la sociedad civil. Otro detalle interesante, único en los procesos de negociación de Naciones Unidas fue que las reuniones se transmitieron por internet y en tiempo real. Esto permitió que muchas personas, como yo, por ejemplo, no estuvimos físicamente en las reuniones, pero enlazarnos con nuestra computadora a la reunión fue posible. Hoy esto es muy común. Ejemplo es esta reunión en la que estamos ahorita de tantos países y en distintos horarios. Pero les estoy hablando de 2014, 2015, 2016. No era tan fácil, ¿no? O tan común. Y esa oportunidad de poder enviar comentarios y propuestas fue todo un acontecimiento. De hecho, siempre se dijo que este proceso no sentara precedentes para otras reuniones de negociación de Naciones Unidas. Y yo quisiera que fuera exactamente lo contrario, que seamos el precedente de cómo deben darse las reuniones de negociación para que la voz de las organizaciones de la sociedad civil, que tenemos experiencia, que llevamos muchos años trabajando en la lucha por los derechos, sea una realidad y que se pueda expresar de manera directa. Entonces, aquí puntualizo el hecho de que las organizaciones de la sociedad civil hubiéramos tenido una participación directa en estas reuniones de negociación fue un precedente muy interesante. El acuerdo se abrió a la firma el 27 de septiembre del mismo año en una ceremonia paralela a la Asamblea de Naciones Unidas. En esa ocasión, 15 países de acuerdo y quedó abierto durante 2 años, cerró el 26 de septiembre la recepción de firmas para que los países se fueran sumando a este acuerdo. Sí quisiera hacer una precisión a la presentación que hizo Inés. México, el pasado 5 de noviembre, el Senado de la República aprobó la ratificación. Todavía nos falta que nuestro país entregue el instrumento de ratificación de manera formal en Naciones Unidas. Estamos en las mismas condiciones que Argentina. En Argentina, su Congreso también ya aprobó la ratificación, pero formalmente no han entregado el instrumento. Entonces, hasta el mes de noviembre eran 9 las ratificaciones. Hoy con mucho gusto les puedo contar que ya son 10, porque precisamente el día 1, Santa Lucía, un país del Caribe, entregó su instrumento de ratificación y entonces hoy ya son 10 países los que han ratificado el acuerdo, 24 lo han firmado. Y de acuerdo, como señala el artículo 22 del acuerdo, se necesita que haya 11 países, 11 ratificaciones para que el acuerdo pueda entrar en vigor. Entonces, hoy por hoy seguimos todavía en este tiempo de saber quién será el país número 11. Habíamos apostado a que sería Argentina y México por estos avances tan importantes que tenemos ya, pero pues tenemos que reconocerlo, nos ganó un país del Caribe. Pues, lo cual, bueno, es un avance y nos emociona saber que ya nada más nos falta hoy un país para que pueda entrar en vigor el acuerdo. Ahora bien, el acuerdo, como había mencionado, garantiza el hecho de eso, a la formación, la participación, a la justicia ambientales. Pero un detalle muy importante que es el artículo número 9 y a la protección de las personas defensoras de los derechos humanos en asuntos ambientales. Es un artículo único, no se tiene en ningún otro instrumento proteger a las personas que están protegiendo los recursos naturales, el territorio. Esto es un caso espectacular, pero aquí nos hace mucha falta garantizar estos derechos de acceso para las mujeres, porque podemos estar hablando de acceso a la información, acceso a la participación, y no necesariamente tenemos a mujeres presentes en estos instrumentos.
Sí. Bien, muchas gracias, Alicia. De repente dejé de escucharte y volviste, así que, bueno, muchísimas gracias por tu respuesta. A ver, creo que había una pregunta para ti. Ahora que no me encuentro. So I thought there was a question for Olympia, but now I can't find it in the chat. So if okay, so we'll leave it for the end. So the end is coming very close because we are actually over time right now. Hani, if you want to just lead the last couple of questions.
That's great. Sorry, I just couldn't hear you for a second, but can everyone hear me okay? Perfect. Yeah, so thanks. We are a bit over time, but there are some amazing questions that we want to get to. The first one I want to start with Fahima, but if others want to come in afterwards, you're more than welcome to. And it's a question that we have on the Jamboard, which is more about the social response to your accomplishments. So Fahima, you mentioned, 3 amazing successes, but how is this perceived by the people?
Thank you. I think it's always, these are things that are always done in a very range of long time and with persistency and I mean tolerance and patience. These stories I spoke about, they were all taken place during a period where civil society were curbed by the government, where we were not able to go beyond the certain things, and changing laws and changing policies. You have to engage with the government in order to reach those kind of consensus. And then having a government that's anti-women, that's not really allowing us as not a part of we don't represent the women that quote unquote they name Muslim women. We are more into Western ideas and things like that. So we had to use a lot of tactics. We had to use a lot of, and sometimes we just keep quiet when we feel that the wind is too high against us. We could keep quiet, go do some trainings, and we send people for things, and we go do more internal work and research rather than we go on demonstrations or do press release or go more public. And then until we brought this, I think we did a lot of steps in order to make this happen. As I got one of the questions that how did this happen so quickly now? And it's not easy. It's just because the revolution that just came in end of 2018 overthrew the Islamist government made that happen. It's not that it's just an accumulation of all these resistance that carried on decades after decade that made that happen at this moment because the environment allowed it. So what we did, when there are some successes also during the Islamist regime itself, where the women's movement were so creative in order to create those and pave those ways in order to work that during this very difficult time. So it's a lot of work. It's a lot of tactics. It's a persistency. It's the belief and internalizing women's rights as part of women's lives, and all this made that happen and made that success. Like changing the rape law took us 8 years. It was until it came into existence, and it came into existence because, for example, one tactic we use, we cannot go to Geneva or to the UN and speak about this in public and come back to Sudan. That risks a lot of people's lives. So what we used to do, we used to liaise and ally with a lot of women groups who have a very strong, prominent voice in the Human Rights Commission in Geneva or in the UN in New York. We ally with them, we send them whatever they need in terms of information and they present that. And that created a lot of pressure. And that pressure made those changes happen. But for us, if we go to Geneva, we will think a million times coming back to Sudan. You know, at that level, we were able to use all the SOCS organization who were playing this role. And we had built like a lot of alliances with several, like more than 8 or 7 international women groups that we worked with in order to make that happen. So at this level, when I'm saying the question regarding these challenges happen, when it comes to issues, when culture is embedded in it, it's so hard to say, yes, the law is ending every violation or is ending FGM or is ending certain kind of thing. No, law is always a good achievement. It's a policy. It's in place to make that always people open their eye in order to say, okay, if you do this, we can take you to court. But you need to work down, you need to sit on the floor and work with people and work with families and work with medical practitioners. It's but when it comes to culture and religion, it takes longer than we can imagine. So we just need to be patient and try to use tools like, as I said, media, and there's now social media, which is great. Everybody is accessing it. So it's easy always to text. It's easy to have a WhatsApp group. It's easy to have a Facebook. It's easy to have a blog and produce more information, narratives of women who have done a successful story or who have had harm of practicing FGM or a case of taken to court. So it's just opening more space for people to take that forward. And I think it's just the beginning now for FGM to be ended.
Thank you so much, Fahima. Does anyone else have any last final thoughts as well? No, everyone's tired and wants to go have a nice drink. Well, that was actually wonderful to end it off of, Fahima, and I want to thank all of you so much for this one. I mean, I learned so much. I was messaging Ines like, "Oh, are we going over time?" And she's like, "Who cares? This is so interesting." It's true. It was so interesting to hear from all of you, all the different experiences you have, but also similar challenges that you're facing, you know, with the cultural progression, the use of language, creativity to circumvent challenges, the fact that cultural change is slow. These are all some common things that were going on, naming things, getting, you know, people to, there's a poll, yep, to get both government and societal backing and influence is great. Keeping things simple is just wonderful. So if, as you saw on your screen, you have a poll, a feedback, please answer. Overall, was this event was a good use of your time? And if you could please vote.
It says in the screen that we can't vote as a host. Oh, no. Okay.
Okay.
Let me see.
So far, it's been great. And I know we have a lot of people following on Facebook Live that unfortunately can't vote on this, but if you on Facebook Live could also put in the chat any of your feedback, that would be great. So before we close, Ines, do you have any final things you want to add to this lovely group?
No, nothing to add. Just thank you very much. I mean, this has been amazing, and you're going to see yourselves reflected in our next State of Civil Society report, because all those stories are really worth showcasing. So thanks.
Thank you all, and thank you for bringing all these great women telling us such a great stories that we learned a lot, and I'm very happy to be part. I was really happy. I enjoyed this session so much. Thank you.
To hear. Thank you all so much. Let's indeed keep in touch and keep this conversation going. Yeah. Ines and I will find a way to gather some of this input and share it further as well. And also, as Ines mentioned, in the next SOCS report. So thank you all again, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Okay. You too. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.